One of the greatest instances of Jewish diaspora occurred in the late 1930s and early 1940s due to World War II. While many Jews escaped from Hitler's ruling in nearby countries such as Austria and Poland, one group of refugees escaped to the Dominican Republic. Refugees were welcomed by the Dominican Republic with government-provided land and resources. Hundreds of Jews traveled to the Dominican Republic and established successful dairy farms as well as other agricultural centers. After facing such a horrific tragedy, those of Jewish descent had become accustomed to being segregated against. What was once a banana plantation had become home for Jews that had escaped Hitler's rule. This allowed for them to freely practice their religion while being introduced to a whole new culture. This diaspora resulted in a brand new establishment of culture in the Dominican Republic. This Jewish settlement did not only consist of those who were of Jewish descent. The lower part of the region had workers that worked on different sections of the islands, as well as charamaicos, which are most closely translated to Christmas trees, which is a little bit ironic, but nonetheless, this was a very culturally rich region, and this allowed for a lot of differences to be discovered, not only by the Jewish people that moved to the Dominican Republic, but also as well as Dominicans themselves. They were brought a whole new wave of culture, synagogues were built, and this whole new wave of culture that had been established due to this great tragedy. And through my research, I found that this was a very well-endowed community. They relied mostly on agriculture for their lifestyles, but they were very in tune with nature. They used their resources to their benefit, and they had established a life completely different than what they had previously established in Europe. One thing that is so vastly different between Europe and the Dominican Republic is the ingredients that they use for food. Now, I want to talk about a couple of dishes that really prove a mixture of cultures. They have very prominent pieces coming from both Dominican cuisine as well as Jewish cuisine. And the first one I wanted to talk about was salami dominico frito. Now, this is basically fried salami, and it's got a bunch of dressings that go with it. It's mostly used during breakfast, and the way you make it is by combining ingredients such as red onion, garlic, oregano, pepper, salt, and the main part of it, Dominican salami. Now, as we know through the course of the class, deli meat is very, very prominent in Jewish culture, and the fact that it was able to be brought to the Dominican Republic was very, very intriguing for me. And along with this, you learn how to make your own salami, which was interesting for me to discover because I didn't realize that salami was actually so easy to make. It's kind of one of those things that you see in the grocery store and you're like, I don't know how that's made. So that's cool though. But I really got the opportunity to learn that it's quite easy, and it has a lot of different herbs and spices that you typically would not find in very Eurocentric Jewish recipes. The next dish I wanted to discuss is called Dominican Jewish penicillin, or classic Dominican chicken soup. Now, chicken noodle soup is regarded by many cultures as the sick food and the one that heals you when you're sick. But the Jewish chicken soup consists of one whole chicken, different onions, as well as matzah meal. But in comparison, the Dominican Jewish version of this recipe consists of chicken. Obviously, that's the basis, but it also has cilantro and calabaza, which is basically any winter squash. And in comparing to the two recipes, you realize that yes, the basis of the preparation and the ingredients are the same, but you can notice the impact that moving to the Dominican Republic had on some Jewish recipes. Typically, those of European descent had not been used to using ingredients such as citrus or herbs in their recipes. Now, the Dominican Republic is very, very well known for its herbs, while in other cases in other Spanish countries, spice is a very large thing. In the Dominican Republic, that's not as much as the case. The emphasis is very much on putting herbs in your food, putting greens in your food. So dishes will often have cilantro, saffron, oregano, sometimes cayenne pepper. And so this brand new catalog of ingredients kind of opened the eyes of these Jewish settlers to Sasua. Now, the day-to-day lives of these settlers was very agriculture-based. They got to Sasua in the around the 1940s, and they very, very heavily relied on agriculture for their livelihood. Along with that, a synagogue was built on the island, so those who attended synagogue could practice their faith, and it actually still stands and is still in operation to date. Along with this, there currently stand 3 synagogues and the entire island of the Dominican Republic. Now, as Marion Kaplan states in his book Dominican Heaven, the Jewish Refugee Settlement in Sosua, it had seemed like this establishment of this community was a safe haven from persecution and from racism that they had endured, but in reality, it wasn't this perfect story. There was still triumph and tragedy. For one thing, as I previously stated, adjusting to food resources that were available, and not only kind of establishing a whole new life completely different from what they had previously established, they also had to adjust to the work that was available, such as agriculture and factories, and along with that, they had to learn an entirely new language, which was very difficult for them. So, while it is regarded, for those who know it, as a story that came from World War II that resulted in the blending of new communities, and it was really something brand new for the Jewish community during this time. Along with this, the 2 communities did not really stay separated. There were practicing Jews who stayed with, their own ideals, but they also kind of began embracing one another's culture, and along with this, a lot of marriages came out of this. Some conversions because of marriage came from this. So this book does a really good job of kind of talking about what we believe would have happened in this scenario, this perfect haven that the Jews were able to go to versus the reality of struggles that were endured during this time. Other research on this has been made available by one Rabbi, Henry Zvi Uko. He was born in Germany, and then in 1939, he fled to Amsterdam, eventually immigrating to the Dominican Republic. So he lived there for a little bit, and this is where we get a few papers of his based on a refugee in the Dominican Republic. He talks about what it was like actually traveling from Germany and Europe in general to the Dominican Republic, and the experience was very treacherous. During this, Uko actually lost all of his belongings, and along with this, a lot of hardship was endured during their travel. So a lot of these Jews had actually been kind of hopping around Europe trying to find refuge, or they had been suffering in detention camps and labor camps. So once they finally got to the Dominican Republic and they were welcomed and they actually received government help, it was amazing to them. So I think that's kind of why there is this sense of a haven related to this history. Now, they had also endured starvation, so coming to a country where there is a lot of fertile ground and agriculture is very big, it took a lot of adjustment. They finally had ample resources and ample food. And while the food was very different from what they had previously seen, a lot of fantastic mixtures of culture came to be. One staple of not only agriculture in the Dominican Republic, but of eating was beans. Beans are a staple of many Hispanic dishes, and that was seen as well in this brand new mixture of culture. Now, in regards to keeping kosher in this region, it was fairly easy because a lot of the food that was being prepared, they grew it themselves through agriculture. They could assure that it was prepared properly, so keeping kosher remained a part of the community. Along with this, the establishment of community was so strong in Sosua. They didn't have kitchens in their homes, so they used a joint kitchen and they cooked for everyone, and then they ate in dining halls. So the establishment of community was still there, which is so important to Jewish culture. You rarely ever eat a meal alone. The importance of community has been highlighted throughout the course and was definitely a major part of living in Sosua. And this community was also reflected with interaction with the Dominicans. I mean, mostly they were the caretakers of the dairy cows, and so they milked the cows, and they were involved in this culture. I mean, the agriculture, which, keep in mind, was very, very different for these Jewish settlers. I mean, mostly they were coming from business backgrounds, but they had this brand new experience, and they were also experiencing this along with the native Dominicans. So this establishment of community, which was very reflective of Jewish culture, they had created their own safe space. They had created their own community on the other side of the world from what they had known previously. But truly, the success of this community was based on food. They established a company called Silka, which made dairy products, and it provided cheeses, butters, milks, any dairy derivative for the entire country of the Dominican Republic. And the other one, Garnadera, made meats, specifically sausages, and it's so interesting to see this stark separation of dairy and meat, because that is also reflective of keeping kosher. So the entire reason that this community was able to flourish and able to survive was based on food. They produced these different meats and dairy products for the entire country, and that is what kept them going. So this establishment of this amazing community where the locals and those of Jewish descent got along, they had an abundance of agricultural resources, they had strong industries stemming from the meat and dairy industries, and they got this brand new expression of culture. They got to express their culture. They got to establish this entirely new life. And doing this research, learning about a community that flourished at such a pivotal time in history where anti-Semitism was at its height. You had this paradise that didn't have any anti-Semitism. You had a group that worked with the Jewish community, and they established this highly successful home for themselves in such an anti-Semitic time in the world's history. It was such a tight-knit group of individuals. The highest amount of settlers there at one time was around 600, so everybody knew each other, they knew the locals worked with them, and they were able to practice their religion, they were able to continue their educations. They got this opportunity to learn about a new culture. This this is why Susua is kind of regarded in history as this haven for the Jews. But unfortunately, after World War II, after Hitler's reign came to an end and the Jews were free to move freely without any legal limitations, unfortunately, the strong presence of Judaism in this community did not remain. Currently, there's about 3,000 Jews that still reside in the Dominican Republic. Most live near the capital of Santo Domingo, and others still reside in Sosua. Jewish holidays are still celebrated in this community. They have a cantor travel abroad for these services, but mostly today, Sosua is unfortunately more of a tourist destination. While it has very beautiful beaches, a lot of the activities there revolve around the water as well as Puerto Plata. A museum does stand in Sosua still, and it is very well run. They have very interesting exhibits on display for the public, but a lot of the land now is covered with villas and condos, and it unfortunately has been very, very gentrified. A lot of the Jewish community that was once there during its peak has not remained. But keeping the memory of this safe haven for Jews during such a terrible point in history for those of Jewish descent and anti-Semitism, keeping this little village in the Dominican Republic and continuing to educate those of its presence is part of Jewish heritage. It's a part of this amazing mixture of Dominican Jewish cuisine that we get. It's a story of triumph, and while the story of Sosua isn't one that is taught in history classes, it's an instance of acceptance and a blending of cultures without any racism or anti-Semitism against one another. This story could be completely different if, the Jews had been hostile towards the Dominicans or the Dominicans had been anti-Semitic towards the Jews, but it's an instance where the two communities worked to help one another out. The Dominicans helped the Jews to establish this community where they could live, and they also showed them new ingredients that they can use in their recipes, and they showed them this entirely new culture. And the Jews did the same for the Dominicans. The synagogue still stands, and to date, a presence of Jews remains. Researching this community and finding out that the reason it was so successful is due to food is a commonality seen throughout history, and it's very interesting that it's seen in a positive light during the Holocaust, where many people were starving and they were enduring anti-Semitism, to go across the globe and to see a fruitful amount of food as well as a community that is thriving through food. It's inspiring while also heartbreaking, because unfortunately those that stayed in Europe endured this debilitating hunger related to suffering. Is eye-opening of parts of history that are broader, and then once you get to research the fine-tuned stories of history, it's inspiring to see that a community of Jews were able to experience a brand new culture and experience this fruitful harvest every single season, and for it to not be discussed as much. It's interesting to wonder why this historical event of cultures coming together and supporting one another during such a time of anti-Semitism is not discussed or even taught in history classes. I believe that the community of Sosua, as well as its impact on culture, food, and history is fascinating, and I hope to be able to share this story to keep the memory of Sosua alive in order to educate those on this incredible mixture of cultures.